Okay, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for coming out, braving the traffic as always, construction, everything we love about Austin. Who is here for the first time to this meetup? Okay, a few people, good. Corey is actually going to talk about NPM, but I'm actually just curious, how many people are actively using NPM right now? Cool. How many people haven't used it at all? Anyone? So, awesome. So we have some experience. Well, hopefully even you guys who have been using NPM, well, actually, let me rephrase that question. So a lot of people use NPM, but how many people have gone beyond typing NPM install? Okay, that was actually the real question.
What about NPM and knit?
NPM and knit, yeah, there's lots of NPM commands that we will talk about, so that's good. So people are at least kind of familiar with it, but maybe not doing much in terms of like publishing packages yet or any kind of fancy stuff. Okay, cool. So you guys should hopefully enjoy this presentation. Like I said, Corey, who is our co-organizer along with me, my name's Brian. Corey will actually be talking about the NPM section, and I'll be helping them out a little bit on the computer. And then I'll be doing our news from the bleeding edge. So for those of you who have not been here before, we pretty much, the name of the meetup is the Bleeding Edge Web Meetup. So as that name implies, we like to talk about pretty much any topic that we think would be interesting to web app developers. Corey and I are both web app developers. So it's kind of like, if we think it's interesting to us, we hope it'll probably be interesting to you. And we think it's a good format in that it's not specific to one language or one technology. So, every month is something a little bit different. So I'll give my little news from the Bleeding Edge roundup, and then I'll hand it over to Corey after that. So Capital Factory, as always, has graciously given us this space for free, which is awesome. So I always like to give them a little bit of a shout out. We also, at the beginning, typically like to ask if anyone has an announcement that they'd like to make to the group, which typically is like if you're hiring for a developer, or if you are looking, a developer yourself who's looking for a job or anything like that, or if you know of a hackathon or anything that might be interesting to the group. If anyone has something like that, now would be the time if you want to raise your hand. Anyone? Okay. And by the way, we do have usually people watching on the screencast, so that's why we're passing the microphone around.
Hi, my name is Stephen Palmer. This is Danny Dyer. We work at Unity Technologies here in Austin. If you don't know, Unity is makes a tool called Unity. It's a 3D game development engine that's very popular for mobile and PC games. We recently opened the Austin office. It's a small group. We are working on services around the Unity game engine, and we are going to be hiring very soon, kind of in the JavaScript space, but really, any great web programmers, we're going to be looking very soon. So if you're interested in the game industry, if you're curious about that, and if you're looking for a job, please come see me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you.
Awesome, that sounds cool. Anyone else? All right, and if you think of something later, you can raise your hand before the end. Obviously, there's always time. By the way, would love to hear a meetup topic about Unity and how it relates to JavaScript and stuff like that. If you guys ever were so inclined, you could definitely ping us afterwards. So, news from the bleeding edge. So those of you who've been here before know that we like to do our little browser update quiz. I always think it's interesting because, if you did this quiz even 5 or 6 years ago, we'd never have anything to talk about, right? Because the slide would just be IE, and depending on how far back you go, Firefox, maybe Netscape. But, nowadays it's actually usually kind of an interesting discussion. So you may have, if you weren't here before, we actually talked about this little icon on the right last time, which is Spartan, Microsoft's new browser. So that's kind of interesting. We're still at version 0 because it's technically pre-released. Who thinks that they know, obviously IE and Safari are pretty easy, but what about the other 3? Does anyone know the current versions of those since last month? You cheated, right? He cheated. I saw him earlier. Actually, to be honest, this wasn't a super exciting month. Some months we get a lot of interesting updates. This month primarily was a Chrome month. As most of you probably know, Opera actually just tracks Chrome now. So Opera, we talk about their releases, but they're not really that interesting most of the time because they basically just use whatever Chrome does. Chrome's release was a little bit interesting from a developer perspective because they, we talk at our meetup pretty regularly about ES6, ECMAScript 6, that's the next version of JavaScript. It's not technically here yet, but it's pretty much here in terms of the browser's really implementing a lot of the key features that we talk about from month to month. And so, sometimes there's a lot of stuff in ES6, and we've talked about some of it in past meetups. Some of it is minor, some of it is obscure, but some of it is actually pretty practical and pretty useful. And these things fall into that category. So ES6 template literals, there's a little example there. Basically gives you a way of specifying templated strings within JavaScript, so to help you avoid big long string concatenation type stuff. And also the lexical declarations let and const. And I actually have a little demo of these just to show you if you haven't seen these, just to run through what they are real quick. It's kind of hard to squeeze everything on there. Hopefully you guys can read it between these two monitors. So the first thing is the template strings, which is this first 2 lines of code. And if you haven't seen Babel, the URL is babeljs.io. It's pretty cool if you're interested in ES6. This particular page is a little interactive REPL, so you can type code directly into it in ES6 on the left, and it'll transpile it to valid ES5, or as we know it, JavaScript, current JavaScript. And it'll validate your code, so if you're typing invalid code or whatever, we'll actually see an example of that here in a second. But it's pretty cool for allowing you to play with the features of ES6. So for example, you can see here, I wrote this little templated string, and the key to a template string is the little backtick. So as you might not be able to see it, but that's not a single quote, it's actually the backtick character. And so that tells it it's a template string. And you might also notice that this also solves one of the annoying little things where if you need to mix single and double quotes in JavaScript, then obviously you can see how it generated it, right? You get into this either escaping them or mixing and matching them in weird ways, right? So the cool thing about this is you can put them both right in the string and you don't have to worry about any of that. And then you tokenize things with this little syntax, right? So my variable name up here gets that value, passes it into the token, and then down here is the output. Pretty simple. That one I would say is the most commonly used thing. Like everyone here, if you write JavaScript, I'm sure you've done string concatenation and so forth. Let is a little less common of a use case, but it's still useful for certain things. So the basic idea of let is, currently in JavaScript, if we want to declare a variable that is not global, we pretty much only have one way to do it, right? We have a var. And var works okay, but JavaScript has what's called lexical scope, right? So what that means is if you're not inside of a function, if you're only inside of like a statement block, like a for loop, for example, then the scope of a variable that you declare in there is not limited to that little for loop, as some people might expect, depending on what languages you might have come from, for example. And so you can see actually in this code, when we run it, it's a very trivial example, but this kind of code actually is very common code that can lead to bugs. So picture it more as a method that might have 100 lines of code, right? And you declare a variable somewhere at the top, and then down below, you accidentally redeclare that variable because you don't realize it, right? That's happened to me before. The other case that's very common, as you see here, the 2 for loops, but probably I'm sure all of you at least once have run into the case where you need more than 2 counters, right? So you end up with var I, j, k, l, however many you might need, right, to sort of create enough variables that they're not killing each other. So this example demonstrates the issue, which is that if you're not careful, your inner I here will actually overwrite your outer I. And it kind of breaks this logic, right? I mean, the person who wrote this logic would expect the outer loop to execute 3 times, the inner loop to execute a few times. And what actually happens is it only executes 1 time, right? Because the inner I ends up overriding the outer I and then shortcuts the logic. And then you actually end up, which is kind of weird if you think about it, but I outside of all that logic, in that scope, it's actually never been declared, yet it has a value, right? So that's what we're all used to. The way you change that, if you just change these to let, that's going to get real annoying. Now all of a sudden, we get our outer loop executes all 3 times. The value does not clobber itself between inner and outer. And then when we exit that block, I is undefined. So that's what let is all about. In those cases where you really want to control the scope of your variables and make sure that they're block scoped rather than lexically scoped, you would use let. And then finally, constant is pretty simple, it is exactly what it says, right? Normally in JavaScript today, we have sort of a convention where we name things if we want to kind of imply that they should be constant. But obviously, let me get rid of that. Obviously, we can't really enforce that today. Now, in ES6, if I actually make that a constant, then you can see I can't even do that. It won't allow me. It actually throws a syntax error. Let me see if I can switch mics. Hello. Check. All right, let's see if this one works. Hello. All right, we'll try this one. Anyway, so that's that. Does anyone have any questions about those particular features? So like I said, the reason I spent a little bit of time to kind of demo them is because, you know, a lot of the ES6 features are, you know, specific math functions or different things like that that are useful in certain cases, but not things that you would use every day. These are things that you really would use every day in everyday coding, and things that would replace constructs that you might be used to in your normal day-to-day coding. So that's why they're very important. And the fact that Chrome, you know, the most popular browser for sure among developers, now supports these out of the box is pretty big news. And Firefox has supported these since the last version or 2 as well. So ES6 is pretty much, you know, here. It's just a matter of getting rid of IE. Image rendering pixelated is kind of an interesting property. It's basically about if you take an image and kind of blow it up and scale it, it controls how that gets anti-aliased or whatever. If you have any kind of need for that, you might check that out. Any pointer, any hover is a new media query that basically allows you to differentiate pointer events on mobile versus desktop. So for example, you can do things like detect if I have a pointer that is fine, which would be a mouse pointer, versus not fine, which would be like a finger, you can actually differentiate that and write media queries against that, which is useful. And then they added a little animation speed slider. If you need to debug animations, you can actually slow them down in DevTools to kind of debug your animation frames, which is kind of cool. So Firefox did not actually push out a production release, and normally we pretty much stick to production releases in terms of what we talk about. It is going to be an interesting release though, so I linked to the beta, and if you're interested, they're actually going to have a lot of interesting ES6 features in that version, but it's not due to come out until I think next week, so we'll talk about it next time. As I said, Opera basically is built now on the Blink rendering engine, which is the same thing that runs Chrome. So they basically track Chrome's features. So they do typically add different like user-facing type features within their browser. But from a dev perspective, there's really not much interesting to talk about this month. Safari and IE, I don't think I've changed this slide for a while. Well, I guess I changed it when Yosemite came out. And then Project Spartan. So I'll recap this a little bit, just if you weren't here last month, and we talked about it. So there's a link to the slides here if you want a little more info about it. But it's basically the new browser that's going to be shipping with Windows 10. And it's actually going to be the first Microsoft browser that ships with a completely new rendering engine. So the Trident rendering engine, which has been shipping with IE since the beginning days of IE, it's still going to be there for backwards like enterprise compatibility. But in terms of the user-facing browser that they expect all consumers to use, it's going to be this new browser, Spartan, which is still a code name. I don't think they've named it permanently yet. So again, if you want the details about all that, check out the previous month's slides. The one thing I did want to mention that I thought was interesting is I just saw this yesterday. So there's one particular CSS property called background blend mode. And it's kind of like if you've done Photoshop, for example, it's similar to the blend mode in Photoshop. Basically, if you have two overlapping images, the blend mode gives you a lot of different options to define how that overlapping area should be rendered. And as you can see, it's been supported for at least several versions in all the major browsers except IE, which is not totally uncommon. Well, on Monday of this week, actually, 2 days ago, Microsoft did a press release announcing a code contribution from Adobe that they merged into the Spartan codebase. So that's like crazy. If you follow Microsoft, I mean, that's a really interesting cultural change. And I mean, we've kind of seen that coming in the last year or so. They changed CEOs, they've been open sourcing stuff. It's really cool. But I point this out because it's very promising on the browser front as well, that they are very serious, technologically and culturally about kind of getting rid of IE and really, stepping into the present with everyone else and into the future. So that's a very hopeful sign from Microsoft. So W3C specs, we tend to highlight one or two specs that might have interesting news. Really, it is a spec technically, but it's kind of, normally we kind of pick specific specs that the W3C puts out. This is really more than that. Again, this is ES6. This is the whole JavaScript language. This is a big one. So whether you call it ES6, ECMAScript, ESNext, the official name, they're all the same thing. And it's the next generation of JavaScript. And so the reason this is interesting is because, as you can see, the pre-release and draft versions of this spec have been like years in the making. But we're now at the point where within 1 month, we've had 3 release candidates of this spec. So that tells you that it's very, very close. Any day now, we should expect the final version of this spec. And obviously, browsers like Firefox and Chrome, for sure, have not been waiting around. But there are always the details that aren't finalized that kind of, make it hard for the browser vendors to really finalize their implementations. So once this spec is completely finalized, that's when we can really have confidence that these implementations that the browsers are putting out are really going to be solid and not changing. One specific interesting spec that I will point out is this fetch API. So it's actually not a W3C spec, which is funny because my section title is W3C specs, but it's from this WG, I'm not sure exactly how people pronounce it. Does anyone know? Yeah, I think I'm gonna call it WhatWig until someone corrects me. Basically, this is an improvement on the age-old XML HTTP request object, which is basically what Microsoft introduced, I think in IE 5.5 maybe, to do Ajax basically. And Ajax, well, the XML HTTP request object works fine, right? We all probably use it every day if you do web development. But more than likely, you probably use jQuery or some other framework where you're making a call that's abstracted, right? Most of us these days aren't writing like low-level calls against this XML HTTP request object. Because if you have any experience doing that, it's actually kind of a funky little API, by today's kind of modern standards. And what this thing is all about, this fetch API, is it was actually put out by Mozilla, and it's their sort of approach to kind of modernizing the whole concept of how we should be doing Ajax calls. So they've actually split out headers, request, and response into completely separate interfaces that have separate concerns. So from an API perspective, the way you deal with those is a lot cleaner than the way it works today with the XML HTTP request object. It's promise-based, which is actually very interesting. So if you're familiar at all with that, typical async code in the old days, it's all callback-based. The newer way that things are kind of moving in a lot of areas is promise-based. And so this API is actually based on promises. So you actually get an object back from your call rather than having to write a function that gets called later. That's actually a big topic in and of itself. I'm not going to get into, but the typed objects for body data is also interesting. So right now with the current way we do Ajax, it's basically just raw data, and it's kind of left up to you to kind of deal with it and figure it out. So this actually has built-in typing and sort of handling of the data from that perspective, including methods that go along with accessing that data. And they've actually planned streaming support, which is really cool. So that means instead of having to wait for an entire request response cycle to complete, you could actually start streaming a response and processing a response as it's coming down the pipe. So that would be super cool. And this is just a real simple example of what the code looks like. So again, if you are used to doing, jQuery, Ajax syntax, you're probably thinking, well, it's not that much better or whatever. But if you compare it again to raw Ajax type coding using that XML HTTP object, it's actually much simpler and much more straightforward. The .then is the promise aspect of that if you're not familiar with promises. So normally you would make a function call, and then you would actually have to handle it with a function that gets called, and then you'd handle it that way. Well, with promises, you can say .then, and it actually returns a promise object that you can treat as an object. So this is actually the fetch API. The reason I bring it up also is because it's not in any of the current public builds yet, or production builds of the browsers, I should say, but it is in the nightlies of Firefox and the Canary version of Chrome, which means that it's going to be coming out very soon. So it's something to definitely start being familiar with, because if this API kind of fulfills its promise of being a lot better and a lot easier to work with, then it's something that you'll probably be very interested in. And GitHub, the actual company GitHub, created a polyfill for this for other browsers as well that's on GitHub. So just a little aside, how many people are even familiar with WetWig or have heard of it? Anyone? Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, especially because, so when I started looking at that spec, I have actually heard of WetWig, but to be honest, I didn't exactly know what it was or what its relationship to the W3C was. So when I looked into it, it's actually very interesting. The W3C, which we've all heard of, was formed way back in the old days of the internet by the actual guy who invented the internet, and he still runs it. And they have a group called the HTML-WG, which is their working group for HTML, subgroup of the W3C. So after HTML4 was released, the W3C started going down this path of XHTML. I don't know if you remember, if any of you guys were web developers back then, it was kind of crazy because XHTML is like super strict and you're dealing with schemas and all this craziness. And so there was a group of people within that W3C that basically said, screw XHTML, that's crazy. We want to stick with HTML, and we want to kind of go forward with that. And so they kind of split off and formed this WHATWG, which is the Web Hypertext Applications Technology Working Group. It's quite a mouthful. And so what's interesting to me is the fact that actually no one in this room claims to have been aware of this group, but they're actually the ones who created all the specs that ended up becoming HTML5. Because what's funny is W3C pursued XHTML for several years until they finally decided it was crazy, along with everyone else. They were just the last ones to realize it. And they ended up, essentially dropping it in terms of, I think, it still exists, but they dropped it as their strategy for the web. And they ended up adopting the specs that Whatwig had been pushing, for several years. And that's what actually became HTML5. And most people, myself included, just assumed that all of that came out of the W3C. But it was actually this other group that kind of was persistent and pushed that forward, which I thought was very interesting. And that group still exists today. And so the relationship today is that this group, Whatwig, essentially kind of pushes their own standards, and they call it living standards because they basically want to move as fast as they can and push the boundaries of the web as fast as they can. And then they've kind of evolved into this relationship where the W3C is much more deliberative. And they basically, when they decide a spec from that other group is interesting enough and it is mature enough, they'll actually, quote, snapshot it at that point and kind of transform it into a stable, mature spec that the browser vendors will actually work off of. So it's kind of an interesting little symbiosis that they've, basically evolved into, but the history of it was very interesting to me, at least. And really, at the end of the day, specs don't really matter. I mean, they're an effective way for people to arrive at consensus and to kind of hash through issues. But in terms of what matters to us as developers, all that matters is what gets implemented in the browsers, right? And cfetch that we just talked about is a perfect example. So that is actually not a W3C spec. That's a Whatwig spec, yet it's already been implemented in 2 of the major browsers, right? So that's really all that matters. So we also like to talk about if there is any big framework or language news, we typically highlight that. There actually wasn't a huge amount of news this month. React put out a minor release, but what I thought was interesting about it was they actually support ES6 class syntax now in React natively. So again, just one more sort of data point in our continual discussion of the fact that ES6 is here today. So if you're not familiar with it, I would say it's probably a pretty good time to start getting familiar with it. Especially if we've talked in the past in some of our meetups about as well, like Node.js, for example, and other server-side solutions where you can actually choose and you can start using ES6 out of the box today in that kind of environment. So segue, not to be confused with Node.js, Node.js. This is completely random, but I saw it, and so I just had to include a slide because why not? But it is exactly what it sounds like. If you actually have to write something in JavaScript that can take a photograph and detect algorithmically whether that photograph contains nudity, then this is your library. There you go. You can pay me later for that. I spent quite a while debating whether I should include a demo of this. I decided against it. So you'll have to go check out that page. Yeah, so pretty light on the news. Depending on what's going on, like I said, sometimes we have more to talk about. Tips and tricks. So you may know the name Adi Osmani. If you don't, if you're interested in all the stuff that we talk about, he's one of the key guys that you should be following, like on Twitter or whatever, because he's a core platform / browser guy at Google, and he's always got interesting things to say, and he's done tons of talks and all kinds of stuff. And this one in particular that he gave recently at a conference is really interesting because it's a really good roundup of kind of what's been going on with Chrome and Chrome DevTools in particular. And really, Chrome has always been about performance, but it seems like lately they're really pushing performance. And it seems to me that it's almost like in answer to things like Facebook putting out their native version of React and things like that, right? Google has a large stake in making sure that the web actually succeeds and that the web doesn't get left behind by native. So Google is all about really pushing the boundaries of performance in the browser. And this is just one example. This was actually something that I hadn't realized. Hang on, it's hard to do with one hand. There we go. So if you go to timeline and refresh, it's kind of funny. I mean, I use DevTools all the time, but it had been a while since I particularly went into this timeline view. And if you ever have like a slow page in your app where you're trying to debug something and you're not sure if it's rendering or load time or whatever, there are tools for this. If you haven't looked at them, like in the last version or two of Chrome, have become really slick. So they've got this little timeline bar, and you can actually zoom right into a section. Like if you know there's a particular section that's giving you problems, you can zoom right into it. You can move this left and right. You know, if you actually dive into this thing, it tells you exactly which methods you're in at any given point. If you watch this graph down here, as I move this, that actually changes and gives you the percentages of, you know, whether you're in loading or whether you're in script execution or whatever. Anyway, a lot to go into that I won't right now, but it's very cool stuff that you should check out if you haven't. And the point of that is that this particular slide deck that I've linked to here, and he's also got a video of his presentation. Every single slide is something like that, where it's either a feature of DevTools that you may or may not be aware of, a lot of tips and tricks about debugging stuff in Chrome. So definitely check that out. Another thing that I've run across is this new libraries.io. This is pretty cool. You know, and actually it's relevant because we're going to talk about NPM here in a minute. So every package system generally has some way of searching for packages, obviously, right? Well, this is kind of a cool thing because it aggregates across all these different package repositories and gives you kind of one way to search across all of those. And you can filter by language, by license, by package type, or any of that kind of stuff. But the most useful thing is this feature. If you log in through GitHub, then you can actually save subscriptions to any of the packages that you use in your own projects, and then you'll get notified anytime any of those packages gets updated, which is pretty awesome. So if you have a project where you are very interested in that kind of stuff, definitely check this out. Upcoming events. So this is actually tomorrow. Did any of the guys from Bitovi make it tonight? No. They mentioned that they might try to make it. So Bitovi are the guys who make CAN.js, and among other things. So they're actually doing some kind of push, I think, to update their documentation. But they basically mentioned that for a, quote, few hours of your time that you would get paid for, you can show up and kind of help them out with that. If that sounds interesting to you at all, this link goes to the posting about that you can check out. There's also a hackathon coming up. It's not until May, which is a little ways out, but this is one of the bigger hackathons. And so if you're interested in that type of thing, I posted it to the slides now because it would be something definitely to get in early on. This particular one is a pretty big one. Like, they have hundreds of thousands of dollars in prizes and stuff, and it's like I can't remember if it's global, but it's at least nationwide across 15 or 20 cities that they coordinate at the same time, so it's a pretty big deal. It's actually located here at Capital Factory, and it's pretty cheap, so definitely check that out if you're a hacker. And now for something completely different. Who here uses Vim? Or who here would like to use Vim but never bothered to learn all the crazy commands and everything? So I'm one of those people actually myself. I'm getting a little bit better, but I still suck at it. And I ran across this thing, which is cool. It's Vim Adventures. So it's actually a game in the browser, and you learn Vim through the game. So it actually, you can see here, K, J, H, and L, those are the Vim, up, down, left, right commands. So you start off that simply, and then as you move through the game, it teaches you copy, paste, move, like all the stuff you need to be able to do using Vim keyboard commands. So it's pretty cool. It's for pay, which is a little bit of a drag, but the way I look at it is, it's for 6 months access, it's $25. So if it's worth $25 to you to learn Vim really well in a way that's pretty engaging, then you might check that out. So that's pretty much all I have for my section. So now we're going to turn it over to Corey and talk about NPM.
Yeah, we can do that. All right. All right, so NPM. What I wanted to cover tonight is not entirely just about creating a module, but a lot of the ecosystem around NPM, because it's being used for a lot more than just Node these days. But we'll kind of start off with the basic what is NPM. And I like to consider it more of a repository of open source projects as opposed to just being Node projects. I think even in the description of the meetup tonight, it said straightforward, the jQuery is now a part of NPM, or that's how it's being distributed. And there's a lot of other things as well. We'll cover a little bit more of that in a minute. But it's also, NPM is also a command line package manager. So everybody, was there anybody, I can't remember now, has everybody at least installed a package like an npm install? Or has anybody not done that? Okay. All right, so you're used to the command line then to bundle Node code or other kinds of code using NPM. And ultimately, NPM is really designed to simplify the development of applications and tooling. What I've noticed with a lot of different languages is that the package management and dependency management in general really plays a major role in how useful that language is. Like Python has its kind of thing, Go has its go get thing, NPM is nodes and other packages as well. And so a lot of that, it really matters a lot because we've got this community that's being built around the different modules and the different packages that are out there. And in some cases, NPM matters like specifically for Node because you don't really have a choice. NPM is really the be-all, end-all of package managers. There are a couple of others out there, but frankly, I don't even remember what they're called anymore. They're just not very useful when there's no content. But of course, NPM is pretty easy to use to start. And then really what it promotes this dry methodology, or don't repeat yourself, which is kind of based on the basic Unix philosophy of building small modules that work well, and then you build on top of that. And so it's kind of just layering your code. And so NPM really helps drive that, which again, we'll cover a little bit more of that in a minute as well. NPM has some standards, and I say kinda here because it provides a standard workflow. So you can run an npm install of your module, and that's one way to deliver. And that's kind of, we all get into these routines where we're used to doing that. Like these days, I don't even want to use code if it's not available in npm because I don't want to go out and do a git clone. I know that if I run my code, I can set up a deployment process that'll run an npm install and run my whole package. And so it's kind of, having it out there. There are ways to get around some of the things that I said, but it's just a way of life. It's ingrained in the way that we use our code and the way that we share our code. So it's a standard way to kind of come together on code in general. That centralized development approach is really kind of the core of this. And again, that gets back to the package managers being the center of the development ecosystem. Again, Node is not the only situation where that is true. But Brian threw this slide in here, and I really like it because it kind of shows the stats of where NPM is today. 135,000 packages. I think the last time I talked about this were about 110,000, so that was 2 months ago, so 25,000 new packages in 2 months. There were, 50 million downloads yesterday, and 1.2 billion packages downloaded last month alone. Yeah, so that's a lot of traffic there. There's a lot of things happening with NPM. So where would you see NPM? I stay at server-side JavaScript because some of you have probably seen the IO.js project, which is basically a fork of Node, moving at a slightly different pace under a different governance model. And ultimately it is NPM compatible, so it's going to act the same way that Node does. You're going to be able to NPM install my favorite package through IO.js as well. It's now being used for a lot of UI components, jQuery in particular. And then there are a lot of different tools that you can bring. So like Yeoman, we've had a talk, I forget if that was last month or 2 months ago, about generating code. You can get Yeoman through NPM, but then you're going to run a yo command instead of running an NPM command. Bower or Grunt or Gulp or a lot of these things, of course, they're all coming through NPM, but at the end of the day, they're kind of taking on some of that same concept that NPM was originally providing via a command line tool that does something for you. And I mentioned Bower specifically here because Bower is kind of like NPM as well. Has anybody not used Bower in here? Okay. All right, so Bower is very much like NPM, except it's focused on the front end. So if you're developing a UI, you're going to see your code dropped into like a components folder instead of a node modules folder. And that's kind of a big deal. And I'm going to show a slide on that in a second here. But really the key takeaway is Bower is mostly UI, NPM mostly backend. That's kind of how things are today as it stands right now. NPM is also often used for app deployment. So if you use different deployment services like CodeShip or Shippable, did Circle do that? I can't even remember. Basically, any kind of app deployment, you can run npm install against your code base, and it's going to download the dependencies. Now, whether or not you want to do that, that's not something I'm going to get into right now, because there's a lot of things that circle around that may be good, may not be good. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are doing that. So they're using npm to actually deploy their apps, to deploy the dependencies, so that your code base can remain focused on what you're trying to accomplish. And finally, infrastructure orchestration. This is something that I'm actually using more these days, more than I thought I would. Just building out your own tooling, building out your own command lines, command line interfaces, Yeoman, all of these things. I use it primarily to run wizards. So instead of having to say, hey, go set up a new GitHub repository or Bitbucket or whatever, I'll just say, hey, go grab this Yeoman generator that I've got through npm, just npm install generator-module or whatever it is, and my team can just use that. So it's a way to kind of mask some of the complexities of your general workflow with infrastructure. And that's something that I haven't seen a whole lot of people using npm for, but I found it to be really effective, so that's why I included it in this slide. And finally, of course, the npm all the things. A lot of people get real npm happy once they start using it to deploy their code. And so that goes back to the app deployment. It's not always something that you want to do simply because you don't necessarily know what modules are going to be used in your code. And maybe when we get into the demo, I can show this, but the dependency tree, when you run or when you install a module, you may see just dependency after dependency after dependency, and the list just gets really, really long, and it can get really bloated. So every one of the modules that is dependent, so one of the major benefits of npm and kind of the Unix philosophy is we build small things and we build layer on layer on layer. But that can also be a negative in this case, because if one of those things breaks, Like a simple example is when Node 0.12 was released, the request module broke. And that is a module that is used by a lot of people to just access APIs. So if you're not paying attention to that stuff, it can be a problem. So if you're deploying new code and you're using just, hey, I'm just wanting to use the request library, well, if the request library is broken, your code is broken too. So you have to be careful. And that's really the point of all of this, is there are some limitations in using NPM for deployment. And I already kind of covered Bower, so I'm going to skip on past that. And just get right to the slide here that shows the difference. So on the left you have NPM, on the right you have Bower. And you can see this is the dependency tree. In Node, you have a lot of modules that are dependent on other modules that are dependent on other modules. Whereas Bower, you're seeing one folder, and that contains all of your code, because it's really structured in a way that your UI, I mean, you're going to be referencing these things through your HTML. Whereas with Node, you have different paths, different ways to include this code. So it's really just more of a structuring thing more than anything, but it is something to be aware of just because you hear about NPM all the time being used for everything these days. But you got to make sure that it's the right fit for the job that you're doing. All right, so I'm going to have Brian kind of walk through this, but that was just mostly background. What I really want to do is go through actually creating a module. We're going to start from scratch, and we're going to go ahead and get this all the way to the point where it's actually out on NPM and usable. And actually, do you want to bring up the registry? Yeah, it's just not doing that. So the first thing that's important for actually getting your code out to the NPM registry is you have to have an account. You can do this in one of two ways. We've actually already set up a new account for edge-ATX, and that account is, you can do this all through the npmjs.org website to sign up for an account, or you can run the command on your terminal, just npm add user, and that'll give you a little wizard to fill out. So that's, we've gone ahead and already done that. And once you have that done, we can actually get started with the code.
So you can't say,
Yeah, so he just typed in the npm add user, and it's asking for a username. And since we've already done this, it's already pre-populated for us. But, so we're going to go ahead and initialize this project with an npm init.
package.
Yeah, there's no package here. And so it's basically telling us, all right, this utility is here to walk us through the process of setting up our own module. It's going to ask us a couple of questions. Some of the stuff's going to be pre-populated, some of it won't. It's asking for name, version, a description, and an entry point. And the entry point is important because this is the code that's actually going to run. It's kind of the entry point or your loader for the module. And then it's asking for a test command. Actually, you have to put in the Mocha test in this one. We're using Mocha for our unit testing. So if, all right, we'll skip it for now, but yeah, so Git repository, keywords, and this is all information, like keywords in particular. If you go out to npmjs.org and search for a module, it's going to pick up on this. It's going to index that. So if you are developing a module that you want other people to use, try to be, informative with the description that you put in, as well as the keywords that you put in. And also something else to mention is a shortcut here is if you create a README file first, whether it be just README or a README.md, it's actually going to include the content of that file as your description. So if you want to just bypass one step, you can create your README first if you kind of have a well thought out module already. And that'll just be one less step that you have to do in the future. So once it's all done, it's going to show you everything that you have entered and give you a yes or no answer. And so we've done that. And now there's a package.json file there. Yeah, so Brian's just brought up the package.json, and this is definitely not an all-inclusive package here. It's just showing mostly the stuff that the wizard produced for us. And it did pick out a couple things, like the fact that we added a repository, it automatically recognized that this was on GitHub, and it picked up the bugs URL a little bit further below. And it pointed directly to the issues of your repository. So there's a couple of nice little things like that built into this wizard that you can do. If you're using another source, like a Bitbucket or GitLab or whatever, it won't necessarily pick up on all these things. It really depends on which version of NPM you're using. So I'll talk a little bit more about versions of NPM after the demo. Okay. Yeah, so you can show some code. All right, so once you have, this kind of lays the foundation for your module, but at this point, we're not doing anything. So we put together a little bit of code here, and was there a link for the actual code?
I didn't push it up to that repo yet.
Okay.
The link is on this slide, but it's not updated yet actually on GitHub.
Okay, if you want to see the final product of this, my GitHub account, it's github.com/CoreyButler, that's CoreyButler, and the project is called, I think I called this one demo. A demo module. So if you're following along either at home or here at Capital Factory, you can check that out. So that's kind of the direction that we're headed here with the code that Brian's going through. So at this stage, we've got a simple logging module. And the use case here is we're going to put together just some simple logs that we're going to decorate the logs just a little bit, make it look a little bit nicer than the standard console.log that you'd see. Eventually we'll get into colorizing it a little bit, adding some prefixes. It's a relatively trivial module, just to kind of illustrate what it is that we can do here. But at this stage, we put together a simple pseudo class, logger function here. We've got a private method called log, and then we've exposed a method through just using this.log. And then we're exporting that. And that's the key here, this last line, module.exports, that's what actually, basically for all intents and purposes, says this is a Node module. Because you can write all the code that you want, and if there is nothing exported, then it's not going to pick up in your Node code.
And so if you're not familiar with Node, if you try to run this file that we just created, it does that, which means it worked, but it didn't do anything, right? It just exposed an API, but nothing is yet using that API. So that's where we're at.
So yeah, baby steps at this stage. Do you want to go ahead and add the color module?
Well, let's show we can run this now.
Okay. All right, so here's the code that will actually run our simple module. And something to notice here is in the first line, we have a require ... index. When you're using a Node module normally, you would say require and then the name of the module. But because we're working locally, we need to reference our own files. We need to reference our own package.json file. So that's how we do that.
Yeah, this file is in a subfolder of example. So that's why we're moving up one and then referencing our main index file.
So at this stage, we would expect to just see a simple hello logged when we actually run this, which it does. All right, so that on its own is obviously not very interesting. So let's go ahead and add a little something to this. So Brian's going to be putting in the chalk module. And chalk is a module for colorizing output on the terminal. There are several others out there. I actually prefer one called colors. But colors actually decorates the object prototype, which a lot of people, or for the string object prototype, and some people just prefer to not have that. Chalk is a way to get around that. It's a little bit more verbose with the code. But it's simple. So like you can see here, the code is chalk.red, and then we've got our message in there. So we would expect this to be red text now whenever we run this. But there is no module. Cannot find module chalk. So how do we get this into our code? You know, the chalk module is one of our dependencies. And this is where the npm command line helps out again a little bit with some simple things. So Brian's gonna put in npm install chalk, and then a dash save or dash s, capital S. And what that's going to do is add that automatically to our package.json file. It's going to pick up on the version that we're using, and can you actually show that? So you'll notice that down at the bottom here, there's a little caret 1.0.0 for chalk. That's basically stating that this module will go ahead and install chalk at version 1.0.0 or greater. You can specify an exact version by using a tilde, or you can actually just type that just 1.0.0 in there if you want. And there's a lot of different utilities. If anybody has questions about it, we can talk later, like npm shrink wrap and some of these other things that will guarantee that you're using a specific version of a module. But for demo purposes here, this is more than we really need. So at this stage, chalk is not defined. Oh, you got open up your code.
You gotta set it to a variable for your chalk function.
Yeah. Good point. There we go. See if that works better.
All right, so there we go. And in Brian's defense here, the colors module, you don't actually have to set a variable because it is decorating global objects. Okay, so now we have a slightly more interesting logging module. That said, so I typically like to advocate a test-driven development or behavioral-driven, just some sort of unit testing. And this gets into something that I'll be talking about right after the demo of trying to instill confidence in your module in the NPM community. Because frankly, who are you? Nobody really knows. Are you a great developer? Are you just testing things out? We don't really know. So unit testing is one way to kind of instill confidence in the modules that you produce that the rest of the world is going to use. So what Brian's brought up here on the screen is we're using Mocha. And we're just creating a really, yeah, we're not even doing that. But we've got a test suite defined here called Logger, and we have an actual test called Instantiate the Module. And we're basically just making sure that this module will even load. If the module doesn't load, of course, we have a problem in our code somewhere.
We don't have that set up yet. Yeah.
So running the test here, it says there's no test specified because we're in the wrong. Did you install?
No. Yeah. So, but this isn't using it yet.
Notice this time he put in the npm install mocha --save -dev. That is going to add to the package.json file again, but instead of making it a dependency, it's going to make it a dev dependency. And that's important because when you go to deploy your code, if you're running it in production, you type in npm install --production, and that will only install the dependencies, not any of the development dependencies. There are several other types of dependencies. You can have peer dependencies, optional dependencies. I think there may even be a couple of additional ones. But the point is that when you specify what kind of dependency it is, it will help you when you're actually going to deploy this code in the future. So at this stage, Brian's added the Mocha development dependency and the chalk regular dependency. And at this stage, so we're back in package.json, and this scripts attribute here is very useful in a lot of ways. When you set up test, you're giving it a command that it's going to run. In this case, we're going to run mocha test. If you were to run mocha test from the command line, it would just execute the mocha test that you have set up. But this allows us to type in npm test. So it doesn't really matter what you put into the test attribute here, it will work. And this is useful if you're working with a lot of the... Yeah, this will help if you're using with a lot of the ES6 stuff. So there's a flag in Node called Harmony. So you can put in Node -- Harmony, and it will enable a lot of the different things that are available in ES6, like proxies and some of the other things, the let and the const and generators. There's a whole bunch of different things that Node has. That you can actually use. So that test thing is actually helpful because it doesn't just require a Node module. You can run shell script commands. You can run just about anything you want. You can also add additional commands in there. Like I usually add one called start, so that I can have one to actually start up what I would be expecting. Like if I'm writing a web server, I'll use npm start to launch my web server and npm test to run my unit tests. And again, that's just kind of a friendly way to share your code with other developers so that you can say, hey, if you want to run my code, just run npm start instead of having to give them, run this particular file. So Brian has gotten to the point now here where he ran the npm test, it executed the mocha test, and instantiated our module, and it's passing. So we're in good shape with our really basic module. And now we have something that we can actually tell the world, yes, it passed and test. So we set up this code is actually out on Travis. So travisci.org, I think, is the one that you can use for open source projects. It is a free continuous integration service or continuous testing. The code here that you're looking at is this was run when I set this module up originally. It's basically the same thing that we just did here, but this gets executed on their servers. You can set up your environment. In this case, I set it up for Node. I think Travis runs Ubuntu, but the point is that there are several of these different services out there. Travis has made a commitment to the open source community, and you can actually create little badges. So if you look at a Node module and you see that it's passing, that's it's passing its test probably on Travis or on one of the other CI vendors. So again, a way to kind of instill confidence in the people that are using your module, and a way to actually show that it works on servers and not just your own laptop.
Just to add a comment, if any of you aren't that familiar with CI and why you might use it, it's useful in general, even if you're just developing your own code. But it's really critical in team environments when multiple people are pushing code to a repository. The whole idea behind CI is that it actually will it'll npm install, recreate the environment on that server as if it's a fresh install, like it will be on your production server most likely. Runs the tests, and if the tests fail, then your push actually fails. So you won't pollute your shared repo with bad code, essentially. So that's why it's so important. So if you haven't done any CI type work, it's definitely an interesting thing to check into.
And along those lines, a lot of the code is hosted, obviously seeing a lot of stuff on GitHub. And you can set up any contributions to come from third parties or other developers. If you're using a pull request against something like this, you can often see whether or not it passed the test right on GitHub. So when people commit to some of my libraries, I'll be able to just go in and see, oh yes, this is still passing my test. So it's not going to regress and break some code or anything like that. So there's a whole workflow around this that can be really valuable when you're using any kind of CI service. So at this stage, we have kind of CI completed. We should probably write a README here to just demonstrate how do you use this module. And again, that's do we have one? Okay.
That doesn't say anything.
Yeah, so we don't have a whole lot in here, but there are several tools. If you search npm.js for Node module, basically just Node module, you should find several different utilities out there. There are some that will actually read your package.json file, generate a README from that, recognizing the dependencies, recognizing any other kind of code examples that you may have. So there's a lot of work that's already been done out there. So I definitely recommend checking out both npm.js for command line utilities to generate README files or any other kind of documentation, as well as Yeoman, because there are a couple of interesting generators out there that can do a lot of this for you as well. And I actually used some of that to generate this README that Brian's going to show you.
Yeah, that's all I was going to show. Again, if you're not super familiar with like GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever, the README, the concept of README has been around forever, but they've kind of adopted that as a nice little standard in that the README file is basically the homepage of your project now, at least if you host on Bitbucket or GitHub. So that's why it's so important. If you plan on sharing your code with anyone and making it public, you definitely want to do the basic sections of like installation, usage, testing. If you expect contributions, it's usually good to put any requirements around that. It's usually good to explicitly state what your license is, all that kind of stuff. So obviously, if you've used GitHub, you've seen plenty of projects, but it's really, once you start publishing, then you really have to start thinking about that stuff.
So yeah, we're just looking, kind of at a completed version of this, I guess. Again, very simple. You'll see a lot of modules that get into a lot of depth. I guess one thing I can say is don't put everything in the README. If you do write a more complex module, add some of that stuff to the wiki, or go all the way and develop a web page for it, to actually document it, because it can get really arduous for a developer to sit down and scroll through this entire README trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And it's just think about how you would want to read the code, how you would be wanting to use this module that you're asking other people to use. So you want to show the version on package.json. So that's all I'll cover on the README, but the other important thing here before we publish this module is the version tag. So right now we've labeled this at 1.0.0. NPM expects you to use the semantic versioning. So you can get into things like beta or alpha, you can use those kinds of things. But the npm command line also has a lot of nice utilities for just incrementing this as you go. Because I've found a lot of times with the modules that I write, there'll be something really tiny, and it'll make a big difference, maybe a typo or something that my test didn't pick up. And so I'll have to go back and just create a minor bump in that. And so there are tools like npm version minor, and that will actually bump your version number up for you and commit that into your local GitHub or into your local Git repository, and then you can publish that. But it's also important because if you try to just keep pushing the same version out over and over, npm is going to complain about that. It's going to say, look, I'm not going to let you do this. And you can override that with a force command, and it'll be like, you better know what you're doing. And that's actually what it says, that you better know what you're doing. So it is important to remember your versioning and take that seriously as your module gets updated. So at this stage, we do have a module that could actually be published. And as I said, if you don't already have an account, you're gonna have to run an npm add user in order to get your account set up so that you can actually publish this out to npm. And so Brian's got the page up here. We have nothing on our account. This is a brand new npm user with nothing on it. And so to publish, all you have to type is npm publish. Oh, you're normally supposed to be able to just do that. Oh, you're not. Oh, you have to do the. All right, so we're going to do the npm add user because we have to.
I thought we did that.
You did it online, but no, you did it here, did you?
I did this. Maybe that's... Oh, of course. Okay, bonus points. Who knows what the problem is?
Are you logged in? Do you have another account?
No, I'm logged into this one.
Are you logged in from the command line? Yeah, because your npm rc may be the problem. If you do npm config get username, I think is what it is. Or that, yeah, you can get that.
Oh yeah, npm.
Yeah, npm config
It's been a long time since I did this particular step. That's why we're struggling. All my projects have been set up for a long time and they're on autopilot.
Actually, that should, I would just give it that.
Failing at the 5-yard line. Failed. Everything's for the rest. Okay, well, we won't belabor that particular point. If we knew why we were not authorized, then obviously our package would show up here, and we can actually pull up like Corey's page, which is
Yeah. Daemon manager. So NGN bridge must have daemon manager. Most of those are. Yeah, that's my too. That's just
So if we knew what we were doing right now, this is what it would look like. We'll figure that out later. So this obviously just lists all the public,
lists all the projects you published, obviously. Pretty straightforward. And then you click into any one of these, and then they're just reproducing the same README that we've already talked about. And then if you're into such things, you can look at your download stats and so forth, which is kind of fun.
So had this worked, we would be able to do an npm install of this module name, which you call it npm demo, I think. All right, so normally you'd be able to type that, you'd be able to go in and create a new project in any other directory, type in npm install npm-demo, and that's going to be loaded into your node modules directory and therefore be available to your code base. That's the code. Of course, it's not working, but if you want to run the npm install bew demo, I think that's the name I gave to it.
I don't think it here. Oh, is it?
That's true. That's
work.
Yeah, I think that's what I called it. Maybe that's not what I called it.
Your README says.
Maybe you didn't publish it.
I published it. Thought I published it. Maybe I saved that step so that it would be.
Well, that's fine. We can just look at. So the point of that was going back into your real code. Well, you can talk.
So we were just that was basically what we were gonna show as far as like the little interactive, treacherous part that we almost got through without failing miserably. And we purposely kept that pretty simple, the code-wise at least. And then what we were gonna do is just quickly show like the more complex example. This is the proper demo that Corey actually wrote up. But if you go to that URL we sent earlier that you can look at, so this is a little more meaningful and a little more practical code-wise.
So the goal originally of this was to create a logging module that doesn't just spit out plain text on the screen. And so just walking through very quickly, this particular module expects attributes to be passed in, which is why I have in line 3 there the config. And the properties are colorize and prefix. So if you want to output your log messages without color, so like if it's going to the syslog or something like that, you can turn the colorization off. If you want to have prefixes on to help debug any particular element, like if you're using console.log versus console.warn versus console.error, this particular module just goes through and adds a nice prefix to each one of those. So the value of this particular module is that you can run something in development. So you can run it on your local desktop. You can see the output. It's going to be nicely colored. Actually, maybe Brian can run that and show the output of it. So all that happened here is we have some basic text. Then we have some almost illegible blue text, has an info prefix on it, a warning and an error. So just some colors added there. The second aspect of this is where that colorize parameter was set to false. So it's just kind of back to your plain logging, but it still has the prefixes there. So again, value of this would be that in a development environment versus a production environment, you could change up one module setting, use a parameter or something like that, instead of having to go in and change how you're writing all of your console.log statements. So that's really kind of this is a fairly trivial use case. I wouldn't actually even recommend doing this in production this way, but for demonstration purposes, it just shows that you can use a Node module or an NPM module to save yourself a lot of time here. And so getting all this out onto NPM is one thing, and then using it is a whole another. We get into maintenance questions, concerns, just use cases that you never imagined will pop up with your code all the time. But that's basically it, I think, as far as the demo of this goes. Just kind of to go through quickly, and this is a really rapid-fire demo. There's a lot more that you can do when you're working on modules. We'll skip this. But so if you want to go back and look at the slides, I don't remember if Brian mentioned this, all this stuff is online on our JTX website, jtx.github.com or .io. And so all this stuff is out there. And these are kind of the step-by-step instructions that I was reading off in my notebook here. So that said, now we've gone through creating a module. Great, so now what do we do? NPM is, again, all over the place. So I always like to advocate using some etiquette when you're creating and producing modules. Again, I've harped on this a little bit, unit tests, just to instill confidence in your module, because there are so many modules out there. You will find probably 10 of the same module or doing the same thing, all written a different way. So just make sure that you document stuff and that you are writing unit tests and you're using the free services that are available out there. We mentioned Travis CI. There's another one called Code Climate. Code Climate has JavaScript support. It's similar to tools like Istanbul that will do code coverage. So if you want to kind of grade your code, like how readable is your code, how usable is it, Code Climate does that. It is a commercial service, but it is free for open source projects. So if you are producing modules for the rest of the community use, it's something that might be interesting. Make sure you're always providing a README. And here's the command line package that I was mentioning earlier. It's called package.json to README. If you install that, you can run that code without having any kind of README. It'll at least give you a foundation there, something basic to get started with. This whole etiquette thing and kind of keeping NPM fit is something that I get kind of adamant about. So there is a link here to do your part in preventing NPM obesity, which is a blog that I wrote out on Medium a couple of weeks ago. Basically what I'm advocating here is always try to use an npmignore file. So we didn't really touch on that in the demo, but npmignore is similar to a git ignore file, meaning that you can exclude specific files, folders, anything from being released to the npm registry. And this is really valuable. I've come across a lot of stuff recently where I'll look at the footprint of just a single application, something really rudimentary, and I'll notice that one of the dependencies I used is maybe, I don't know, 10K, and it has 20 megs of documentation. So it's like, there can be some really drastic extra elements that are completely unnecessary for running in production or for running your code at all. So keep your stuff separated, keep it split out, and use the npmignore file to only publish what's actually necessary in your module. If people are going to be looking at examples of your code, take the extra step and make a website for it, for your documentation, or at least put out in the wiki or README or something of that nature. But don't clutter up NPM. Because as it is right now, one of the things that I will say is underscore is an incredibly popular module, but it was used, I think, something like 65,000 times a day, and I think I'm probably actually underquoting that. But when you take the amount of traffic from just the README file or just from a single, like they actually distribute both their regular code, like the unminified code and the minified code. It's not really necessary when you're using it in production or if you're just using this module. And by reducing that, they could save 6.5 gigs of traffic every single month on NPM with just one module. Remember, there are 135,000 out there right now. So do your part, keep NPM clean. When you're contributing to other projects, try to use the author's style. It may not be your own style, but remember that they are the ones ultimately maintaining the code. Remember that if you are writing code and you have people that are contributing to your repository, it's okay to ask them, use my style. Because at the end of the day, you're responsible for it. And there will be a lot of demands from a lot of different people. Sometimes people can get very adamant. Most people are very polite about things, but there'll be a lot of people that'll get on your case because they want to see a feature right now. And so they'll go out and they'll write that code for you and they'll submit it and you'll look at it and say, this doesn't fit any of the styles or standards that I have. And it can be really hard for you to maintain. It might not even be in the right direction. So just use common sense and take a look when you're contributing to a module. Try to use that author style of coding. So if they're using 4 spaces for tabs, use 4 spaces for tabs, even though you may prefer 2. So little things like that can make a big difference. And that also goes along, if you want contributors to work on your code, try to include as many different things as you can to help guide the contributions that come in. So simple example here is the JS hint file. You can actually enable certain things, you can disable certain things by using that JS hint file. It will work with most editors. You can use it in Travis CI and other kinds of CI services. So take a look, see what you can use. Just try to help guide people along if they're going to, if you expect people to help contribute to your code base. The final thing is don't abuse NPM. There are copyrights out there. Remember that you may want your module to be named something very specific. If you don't own the copyright on that, be careful. Don't get yourself into trouble. And there's a whole code of conduct out on the npmjs.org website. So I recommend checking that out if you're seriously thinking about releasing any code or just getting involved in that in the community at all. So workflow. Make sure you research first. If you're planning to produce a module, make sure it either doesn't exist or your module adds some sort of additional value or separates itself somehow. Because again, it is a very quickly growing code base. Then build it, test it, publish it, and the last thing is announce it. I can't stress this enough because there's a lot of great code out there that I've never heard of, and I'll just come across it through a GitHub search or some other kind of search, and I'll be like, why haven't I heard of this before? So don't be afraid to announce that you've produced some new code. If it's not the best code in the world, nobody really cares because you're being active, you're pushing stuff out there, and that's probably the most important thing, is get out there and share. That's how you learn, that's how you teach, that's how you just contribute to the community and participate. So when I first got started writing Node modules, I sent in just a couple of notices. Daily.js is is anybody using this service? Just a newsletter service? One? Okay. All right, so Daily.js is not actually daily. It used to be, but it's not so much anymore. But they will still send out, anytime they collect enough information about a new module, or maybe something interesting going on in the Node community, even if it's not a module, they'll send out an email. And so I started out by putting out a module that I call Node Windows. And I sent it into there. I didn't really expect a whole lot of traction on that, and I had a couple hundred people following the project after that, just from that exposure. And that's only a small base. I think there's only about 30,000 readers in that particular one. But get the code out there. Let people know that you've written it. Node Weekly is another one, and if you tweet stuff with the Node.js hashtag, it will get picked up because there's a lot of bots out there that are reading, parsing the Twitter pipeline here for Node.js. So it can get syndicated. You will get people to take a look at the code, and if nothing else, that can be real value add, even if they don't use it. There may be comments you can see, just kind of get some review from outside of your own head. And I always advocate that because it's really easy for us as developers to get caught up in what we think is the best way to do something, not necessarily how everybody else is going to perceive it. So I think this is a really important thing. And then finally, Mocha.js is awesome. I advocate that a lot. It's used in a lot of different projects. There are, of course, other testing modules out there, but That's the one that I recommend. And try to learn some of these command line shortcuts. It'll save you a lot of time, especially if you start producing more modules. And that kind of gets into the concept of private registries. So far, we've just been talking about releasing code to the NPM registry, but it is possible to maintain your own NPM registry that's completely private. So if you're working at a company and you need to have all of your code behind a firewall, you can use something like this. This is actually a screenshot from my own private repository. There is some work involved in this. It is definitely not, there's not a whole, it's not finalized yet. It's evolving at this stage. So the module that I use is called Synopia, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It's a free module, runs as a server, just a web server, and it handles all the same commands that the main NPM registry will handle. It's kind of cool because you can set your local registry to use your private code base. And if let's say you go and run npm install Mocha. Well, you don't have to have Mocha in your private registry. Synopia will say, oh, I don't see this, and it's going to go out and just proxy that request off to the public NPM registry and bring that back. And of course, you can bring those modules in if you want to, whether it's just making sure that you have, if you're worried about network connectivity or something like that, you can clone as many of the modules as you want into your own private registry. But it is kind of an interesting concept, and it is evolving right now. There's not a ton of stuff out there. NPM, Incorporated does have something, but they've stated coming in early 2015. It's not truly here yet, except for I think there are some beta testers using it. Node.js put in here, maybe because they were recently acquired by GoDaddy, but there's two elements to Node.js. They do have a hosted private registry, but they also have a module where you can go and implement your own private registry. So it's an alternative to Synopia, and there are several others out there as well. Again, the state of these are different and flexing every day, but Synopia seems to be the one that is generating more additional projects. Like I've recently seen GitHub authentication, LDAP authentication, those kinds of things, as opposed to having to go and hard code your own user base. So there's some interesting stuff there with private registries, and when you maintain control over that, you can do a whole lot of really interesting things. So definitely check that out if you like the whole NPM ecosystem and the dependency management that it offers, because that can be a real asset within your own organization. So finally, a couple of tips and tricks. npmi is the shortcut for npm install. So if you really can't type in install, you can do that. The -s, Brian showed this earlier. That's how you can save your module to a package.json file. npm link is an interesting one. If you are developing a command line application, or frankly even any other kind of module, you can run npm link inside the directory where your module exists. And that's going to create a global symlink, essentially. So then you can navigate over to another directory, another application on your computer, type in npm install the name of the module, and you will actually be referencing your local module as opposed to going out over the wire to the npm registry. So that's an interesting one. Check that out if that's of interest. And then npm update npm. npm itself is a module that can be updated. So a lot of people don't actually know that there are a lot of iterations on npm and production releases before it actually ends up in a new version of Node, because they're not tracking one-to-one. So if you want, and if you need something new, or if you want to leverage a new feature, run this. And run this code, you'll get the new version of npm, and you can take advantage of that. And then I had mentioned the package.json stuff earlier, specifically the Harmony flag. That's just, again, a way to say, if you don't want to make your users throw that flag in there for right now, you can add that flag in your scripts and just tell them to do an npm test or an npm start. So a lot of this stuff are really kind of seemingly minor things, but they make a big difference in your overall workflow. So a couple of highlights on the npm roadmap. They've been talking about multi-stage installs, which frankly, I just wanted to make people aware that that is something that is out there. It's not entirely clear exactly what direction that's going, so I'm not going to dive into it too much, but I can say that when you're working with modules, there are some additional scripts that you can run, like there's a pre-install and a post-install. I actually use this in my Node Windows module because it has a couple of binary dependencies, some exe files that need to run on a Windows system. So I actually will utilize the pre-install to make sure that the right binaries are in place in order for the module to work. And then in some of the frameworks that I've built, I'll use the post-install to do similar kinds of things, like make sure that I'm using the right dependencies based on the operating system. So it's kind of like being able to, it's almost like a little hook that you can use a pre-hook or a post-hook. So that's kind of interesting. Then they're talking about progress bars. So you see a progress bar as it installs instead of just this big block of text as you run an npm install. Automatic dedupe or deduplication. That's something that I personally am very excited about because it will shrink the footprint of your application. This is basically reducing the modules that you don't need, that have been included by multiple packages. And if you take a look, I actually have some examples of this on that blog posting that I mentioned earlier, but you can dive into the code base of someone else's module and find some of the dependencies. And if you're using those same dependencies, or if another module is using those same dependencies, you can flatten your structure a little bit and save yourself a lot of space. So automatically doing that would be really nice, but to date, there isn't really a way to do that. And for anybody that's heard of npm prune, that's a slightly different thing, so I'm going to just nip that one in the bud right now. That's stripping modules out that aren't actually in use in your code. Automatic duplication is saying, no, we see that there are duplicates in this dependency tree, we're going to clean them up for you. So that's kind of it's a behind the scenes thing that is actually kind of a big deal. And that gets into the dependency management. There's more peer and optional types of things. They're talking about a better shrink wrap, and of course more thoughts on use cases outside of the Node ecosystem. Again, jQuery kind of being a pioneer in that regard. Did you know much about those collections? Because I didn't really look at that all that much. Okay. I can't talk about this too much because I just saw it this morning, but I did see there's a concept of collections in npm where you can install basically groups of packages or groups of modules. So it's something to keep an eye on because it could save a lot of time. It could also cause us a lot of headaches about knowing what's in which group. And it could get fairly complex, but I'm hoping that as NPM Incorporated settles around that, we'll see some more standards coming out. And that is it. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian to kind of close out here. But thank you.
Does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah.
I have two questions. npm link, is that not going to be on Windows? Because symlinks on Windows is not something I try and get into.
So the question is npm link going to work on Windows, which does not have symlink support?
Windows does have symlink support. It's just a pain in the ass.
Yes.
It's not as horrible as it looks though. And I've been running npm link on my Windows 8.1 box for a couple of years now. Haven't had any issues with it. So.
Okay. My second question is integration with GitHub repositories. There's been a couple GitHub repositories that I've sent pull requests to, but they have not. They'll accept my pull requests, but they won't update the npm repository. Is there any sort of like automated way that like if the Travis CI build is passing, it'll go update the npm repository?
So the question was, when code is contributed to an existing module and that code is accepted in the pull request, it will exist in the repository, but it hasn't been pushed out to npm as a new version or as a new release. So is there anything that we can do about that is the question. Unfortunately, not really. Even if it's passed in tests, there's not a whole lot you can do, but if you search through the npmjs.org site, you'll often see a lot of duplicates of things. I actually had that exact same issue. I was using log entries for a while, and so I just created log entries 2 on npm, and I just pushed all my changes there. But there's nothing that you can do if the author doesn't respond.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I've actually run into that in some of our projects. And the two ways we've approached it is the first way, the preferred way, is obviously you contact the author and ask if you have it. And we've actually done that. Like there was a project that we used from NPM, and then we actually PR'd a change. The guy accepted it, and it was the same thing. We're kind of like, all right, when are you gonna update? And so then we just sent him an email, and it actually didn't occur to him because it wasn't a hugely popular package or whatever. And so he was like, you guys are literally the first people who've even asked me to bother doing that or whatever. So he's like, yeah, sure, no problem. And he just pushed it out. But then we've had the case where that doesn't work. And so we've actually, for one or two things, we'll actually, if it's on GitHub, for example, we might fork the original repo on GitHub, do our fixes or whatever. And then in NPM, we didn't show this, but you can actually point to a GitHub repo directly in your package file, package.json, and then you can specify, it still is the same package name or whatever, module name, package name, but instead of pointing to NPM, you're actually just pulling down from your GitHub repo. So that's not ideal because, once you've forked their code, then obviously you're responsible for your fork. But if you want to be able to leverage the same semantics and all that kind of stuff without having to, do a bunch of extra work on your local development side, that's one approach. But yeah, ideally, you would obviously try to convince that person, if they've bothered putting it on NPM and people are using it, you would hope they would update it.
I just want to give a shout out for a Node module I like. If you actually end up working with you end up working with multiple registries or having private registries. There's one called NRM, stands for npm registry manager. It's a quick little command line utility to switch back and forth between different registries. And I find it really simple and useful.
Cool. Yeah.
Can you talk about shrink wrap? I think a lot of people don't know about it.
Yeah, so the question is just, Corey glossed over shrink wrap really quick, but if you're not familiar with it, you might be wondering what that was.
So shrink wrap is a way, the name alone kind of gives a way of what it tries to do. You're packaging up in a very specific view of your dependency tree. So you're going to make sure that you're using the exact version. So if you run an npm shrink wrap, it's going to essentially create a snapshot of everything that you're using at that point in time. I almost kind of think of it like a system image. So like if you're imaging a hard drive or something, it's a little bit like that. But it will allow you to deploy your code on a very specific set of modules. So if you have a very strict dependency on a particular module that you just absolutely cannot change, npm shrink wrap is the way to do that. Does that kind of answer the question that you were going for, or did you have?
There's a little bit more to it.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, feel free to. I don't actually use shrink wrap all that often, so.
So it's designed for, you have your code on, you've got all your dependencies, right? And you go to push it out to your deployment server, and everything's described with semantic versioning. And it's possible that between those steps, right, as it goes from your dev machine to your build machine to wherever, that something has changed and you pull down a different version, or if you blow away your node modules directory, right, you'll get a different version. And so, how do you know that it's going to work, right? That it's the one that you tested against, ran all your tests against.
Right, so
a reproducible build.
So if I can summarize, I think this is actually a very large topic of discussion because it's really not, the question is really not about shrink wrap. The question is about the broader question of how do I most effectively control versioning of dependencies during deployment. Shrink wrap is one option, and as for anyone who couldn't hear or if anyone watching online, the basic gist of the comment was even with shrink wrap, which essentially shrink wrap goes through all your dependencies and says, yeah, exactly, you're using semantic versioning, so dependency X is at version 1.0, and shrink wrap basically guarantees that all those versions are going to be kind of pinned to those versions. But even with that, this has happened before. Some authors, authors can push whatever they want to push, right? And so if an author pushes a change that is semantically version compatible, and that change happens to land between your staging verification and your production push, right? So that can happen. And so in production, you run an npm install on the exact versions, nothing has changed version-wise, but some piece of code has actually changed. It's totally version compatible, but for whatever reason it breaks your app or something, right? That can happen. There's not like a 100% super great answer to that. So one thing that some people do is they actually version their node modules, because that's like, at the end of the day, right, when we're talking about package management, when you're pulling code down, at any given time, from 1 minute to the next, it doesn't matter what version numbers are specified, the code itself, it's possible that code could have changed from one pull to the next pull. And the only way you can be absolutely certain is what you've pulled down is what ends up in node modules, right? So node modules itself, if you physically copy it from one machine to the other, that's literally the only absolute 100% guarantee you have, right? That's the whole concept of like on binary systems, you zip everything up, you create an executable or whatever, right? That concept is how you actually guarantee it. Now, is it a good idea to version node modules? Not really. Some people do advocate that, and we actually did a little experiment ourselves to try that, and that sucked. I would not do that. So, you know, kind of like I can speak to where I am personally right now, which is our, you know, strategy is basically we use npm and dev all day long, get everything where we need it, and then we use VMs on AWS, so we actually push everything out to staging, still using npm, but from staging to production, we actually copy our entire VM. So we don't mess around in production with npm install, hoping that the versions are the same, hoping that nothing gets updated, hoping we don't miss something. We get everything validated in staging, and then we literally copy over the entire, you know, VM and just use configuration to change it from staging to production. So I'm not saying that's the answer for everyone. That's kind of where we're at right now. It has its drawbacks as well. But yeah, it's a big discussion, you know, that's well beyond what we have time for right now.
That is part of the reason that I brought up the private registries as well, because that is a way that you can guarantee a specific module by cloning in whatever you want. So that's kind of one of the directions. But at the end of the day, NPM wasn't really designed for deployment. It was designed as a package dependency management system. So just kind of keep that in mind. Shrink wrap is not going to go away, but there are, this is, as Brian said, this is a very deep discussion that we could get into, but the private registry direction is one that NPM and kind of the rest of the community has been circling around for a while to resolve this exact issue. So pick your poison. There's a lot of different ways to accomplish the same task.
And I'll just close out with one final comment, which is where shrink wrap really is still valuable though, is if you use some hosted platforms like Heroku, for example, and a lot of other ones like Nojitsu until it got acquired. You know, their whole model of deployment is based on NPM, right? So if you're using a platform like that where you don't have a choice, like you pretty much have to use NPM to deploy, then shrink wrap is at least better than nothing, right? You're at least giving yourself a pretty good chance of, you know, getting your dependencies at what you expect. So to me, that's kind of the primary use case, is if you have to use NPM to do that, then that's, you know, a good option. But I think there's other options aside from using npm install, at least to production. So, any other questions on anything that we talked about? Cool. Well, thanks for coming out. We typically invite people. Corey and I are going to head over a block over to Buffalo Billiards and have a beer. So if anyone feels like hanging out, talking more about npm shrink wrap, anything else, any final comments or questions before we wrap it up? We're always looking for anyone who's interested in speaking, presenting on a topic, anyone who's interested in sponsoring pizza for your company, anything like that. So if anyone's interested in any of that kind of stuff, come see us afterwards. Did you have a question?
You touched on IOJS, and when I was here 2 months ago, you touched on it too. I was reading their meeting notes from Node.js, and it looked like they made a lot of progress, and it looks like those two projects will actually end up working in the near future.
Yeah, so the question was on...
Just got released today from the Node.js advisory board of the meeting that they had on Monday. So yeah, it looks like they made a lot of progress, and that is, it's looking like it's going.
Yeah, it's really more just a comment on the Node versus IOJS thing. So the comment was that just as of this week, it looks like they're making progress on sort of coming back together, which if you're a Node person should make you very happy. Forward progress is really good, which is what IOJS is all about. But continuity and cooperation is always good too. So good sign on that front. Cool. Well, thanks for coming out. And if you can head over with us, cheers. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.